I stopped answering the door on the day they brought me the letter with his name on it. Not my husband's name, though the world believed I mourned him still, but the name I had written in secret on 100 unsent pages, the name that lived in my chest like a second heartbeat, unsteady and aching. James Sinclair. The Duke of Ravensmoor now, they said, returned from war a hero, decorated and distant, a man carved from stone and silence. I had not seen him in 6 years, not since the night he left me standing in the rain with nothing but a promise he never kept and a child I would lose 3 months later. They did not understand why I refused every suitor who came to Ashford Manor. The widows of good families were expected to remarry, especially those still young enough to bear more children, still handsome enough to ornament a drawing room. But I had no interest in ornament. I had no interest in anything at all. My husband, Lord Peter Ashford, had been a kind man, older and undemanding, and his death had brought me relief more than grief, though I wore the black silk and the appropriate expression and let the county believe what it wished. It was easier that way, easier than explaining that I had been a ghost long before he died, that my heart had stopped beating the morning they told me my son was gone. My son. The words still caught in my throat like something sharp. He had lived only 6 months, a small and perfect creature with dark curls and eyes the color of smoke, and I had loved him with a ferocity that frightened me. I was not supposed to love him that much. He was not my husband's child, though Peter had claimed him without question, had given him his name and his protection, and asked nothing in return. Peter knew. He had always known. And when the fever came and took my baby in the span of a single night, Peter had held me while I screamed, had buried the child in the family plot, had never once spoken the truth aloud. I owed him my gratitude. I owed him my silence. I gave him both, and when he died 4 years later, I gave him my mourning too, though it was another man's face I saw in my dreams. James Sinclair had been a captain then, the second son of a minor earl, a man with no fortune and no prospects, and a smile that could undo me with a glance. We had met at a garden party, an absurdly frivolous affair with paper lanterns and strawberries and too much champagne, and by the end of the evening I had let him lead me into the shadow of the hedge maze, had let him kiss me with a hunger I had never known existed. I was 19. I was promised to Peter Ashford. I was reckless and alive and entirely unafraid. For 3 months, James and I met in secret, in borrowed rooms and hidden gardens, in the early mornings when the house still slept. He told me he loved me. He told me he would find a way. And then his father died, and his older brother took ill, and the war called him away, and he left without a word. I discovered I was pregnant 2 weeks later. I married Peter Ashford 1 month after that. He was 43, a widower with no children, a man of reputation and quiet wealth who had courted me with patience and respect. He did not love me, and I did not love him, but he offered me safety, and I took it. I thought I could forget James. I thought I could build a life from duty and decorum and the careful architecture of a respectable marriage. And then my son was born, and I looked into his face, and I knew I had been lying to myself all along. Peter never asked me whose child it was. He simply held the boy, named him Thomas, and registered him as his heir. He was kinder to me than I deserved, and when Thomas died, when I woke to find him cold and still in his cradle, Peter did not tell me it was God's judgment or that I should be grateful for the time I had. He simply let me grieve. He gave me space and silence and the freedom to disappear into the countryside, into this house with its gray stones and its endless rain. When he died, I did not leave. I saw no reason to. The world had nothing left to offer me. But now James was back. The letter had arrived 3 days ago, delivered by a servant in Ravensmoor livery, a young man who waited at the door with his hat in his hands while I stood in the hallway and stared at the envelope as though it might burn me. I did not open it. I set it on the table in the entryway and walked away, and it sat there still. untouched, while I moved through the house like a woman underwater, slow and weightless and numb. I did not want to know what it said. I did not want to hear his excuses or his explanations or whatever polite formality he had composed to justify his silence. But the letter was not the only thing he sent. This morning, as I stood at the window of my bedroom and watched the rain streak the glass, I heard the sound of carriage wheels on the gravel drive. My housekeeper, Mrs. Bellamy, knocked softly and told me there was a visitor. I told her to send him away. She hesitated, her round face creased with worry, and said that the gentleman had insisted, that he had come a very long way, that he had a child with him. A child. The words did not make sense. I turned from the window and looked at her, and she met my gaze with something I could not name, something that looked almost like pity. I went downstairs. I do not know why. Perhaps I was curious. Perhaps I was angry. Perhaps I simply wanted to see his face again, to prove to myself that I felt nothing, that the past was dead and buried and beyond resurrection. I walked slowly, my skirts whispering against the stairs, my hands cold despite the fire burning in the hall. Mrs. Bellamy opened the door, and I stepped into the drawing room, and there he was. James Sinclair, the Duke of Ravensmoor. He stood by the fireplace, taller than I remembered, broader through the shoulders, his dark hair touched with gray at the temples. He wore a traveling coat, damp from the rain, and his face was thinner, harder, carved into angles that had not been there before. But his eyes were the same, gray and steady and unbearably familiar. He looked at me, and I felt the floor shift beneath my feet, felt the air leave my lungs in a rush. I had prepared myself for indifference. I had not prepared myself for this. He said my name. Just that, nothing more. Eleanor. And I hated him for the way it sounded, soft and careful, as though I were something fragile he was afraid to break. I lifted my chin and met his gaze and said nothing. I would not make this easy for him. I would not pretend that 6 years of silence could be erased with a single visit and a letter I had not even opened. Then I saw the child. He was standing half behind James, small and solemn, perhaps 5 or 6 years old, with dark curls that fell across his forehead and eyes that were too large for his face. He wore a coat that was slightly too big for him, and his hands were clasped in front of him, and he looked at me with an expression I could not read. Curiosity, perhaps, or fear. I stared at him, and something inside me cracked. A fracture so sudden and so deep that I had to grip the back of the nearest chair to keep from falling. He looked like Thomas. Not exactly, not perfectly, but enough. Enough that my breath caught, enough that my vision blurred, enough that I had to close my eyes and count to 10 before I could trust myself to speak. When I opened them again, James was watching me, and there was something in his face that I had never seen before, something raw and unguarded and almost pleading. He took a step forward, and the boy moved with him, and I realized, with a dizzying rush of confusion, that they were connected, that this child belonged to him somehow, that he had brought him here for a reason I could not begin to fathom. I should have asked him to leave. I should have turned and walked away and locked the door behind me, but I could not move. I could not look away from the boy, from his small, serious face and his gray eyes and the way he stood so close to James as though seeking protection. I thought of Thomas, of the weight of him in my arms, of the way he had looked at me in those last hours, feverish and fading. I thought of the grave in the churchyard, the small stone with his name carved into it, the flowers I brought every week even though I knew he was not really there, that he was nowhere, that he was gone. James spoke again. His voice was low, steady, the voice of a man who had learned to command soldiers, to make decisions in the chaos of battle. He said he knew he had no right to come here, no right to ask anything of me. He said he had spent 6 years trying to find the words, trying to find the courage. He said there was something I needed to know, something that could not be written in a letter, something that would change everything. I looked at him, at the man I had loved and hated and tried so hard to forget, and I felt the walls I had built around myself begin to tremble. I did not want to hope. Hope was dangerous. Hope was the thing that had nearly destroyed me. But the boy was still watching me, and James was still standing there, and somewhere deep inside me, in a place I thought had gone cold and dark years ago, something flickered to life. I heard myself ask the question, though I did not recognize my own voice. Who is he? Not who is the child. Not what do you want, but who is he, as though I already knew, as though my body understood what my mind refused to accept. James looked at me for a long moment, and then he reached down and rested his hand on the boy's shoulder, a gesture so gentle and so protective that it made my chest ache. The boy looked up at him, and James nodded, and then he turned back to me, and when he spoke, his voice was barely more than a whisper. "His name is Thomas," he said, "and he is your son." The room tilted. The walls seemed to close in, and the air turned thick and impossible to breathe. I shook my head, a small, desperate movement, because it could not be true, because Thomas was dead, because I had held his cold body and kissed his forehead and watched them lower him into the ground. I had mourned him. I had buried him. I had spent 5 years learning how to live in a world without him. And now James was standing in my drawing room, telling me that everything I knew was a lie. I tried to speak, but no sound came. I looked at the boy, at Thomas, at this impossible child who could not exist, and he looked back at me with those wide gray eyes, and I saw it then. The resemblance I had been too shocked to recognize before. Not just in his face, but in the way he stood, in the tilt of his head, in the small dimple that appeared when he pressed his lips together. My son. My baby. Alive. I took a step forward, and then another, and I did not realize I was crying until I felt the wetness on my cheeks, hot and sudden and unstoppable. James said my name again, a warning or a plea, but I was not listening. I was looking at Thomas, at the child I had lost, at the miracle I did not deserve, and when I finally reached him, when I finally dropped to my knees in front of him and took his small face in my trembling hands, I knew that nothing would ever be the same. He did not pull away. He stood very still, watching me with a solemnity that broke my heart, and when I whispered his name, when I said Thomas, my Thomas, he blinked once, slowly, and then he smiled. It was a small smile, tentative and uncertain, but it was there, and it was real, and it was enough. I pulled him into my arms, and he let me, and I held him the way I had not been able to hold him that last night, the way I had dreamed of holding him 1,000 times since. He smelled of rain and wool and something sweet I could not name, and he was warm and solid and alive, and I did not care how it was possible, did not care what it meant, did not care about anything except the fact that he was here, that he was mine, that I was touching him again. Behind me, James said something, but I could not hear him over the sound of my own heartbeat, loud and frantic and impossibly hopeful. I closed my eyes and pressed my face into Thomas's hair, and for the first time in 5 years, I felt something other than emptiness. I felt everything. I do not know how long I stayed there, kneeling on the floor of my drawing room with my son in my arms. Time seemed to have stopped, or perhaps I had simply stopped caring about its passage. Thomas stood very still, his small body tense at first, then gradually softening as I held him. He did not speak. He did not ask who I was or why I was crying. He simply waited, patient and quiet, as though he had learned early that the world required stillness from him. Eventually James spoke. His voice came from somewhere above me, careful and low. "Eleanor," he said, "we should sit. We should talk. There is much you need to understand." I did not want to let go of Thomas. I did not want to move or speak or do anything that might break the fragile reality of this moment. But I could feel James watching me, and I could feel the weight of the questions pressing against my chest, and I knew that I could not stay on the floor forever, no matter how much I wished to. I loosened my hold on Thomas and looked up at him. His face was serious, his gray eyes studying me with an intensity that seemed far too old for a child of 5 or 6. I reached up and touched his cheek, just once, a brief and trembling gesture, and then I forced myself to stand. My legs were unsteady, my hands were shaking. I turned to James, and the expression on his face nearly undid me again. He looked relieved and exhausted, and something else I could not name, something that looked almost like fear. I told him to sit. My voice came out stronger than I expected, cold and clipped, and I was glad of it. I needed the coldness. I needed the distance. If I let myself feel too much, if I let the hope and the rage and the confusion wash over me all at once, I would drown. James nodded and moved to the sofa, guiding Thomas with a hand on his shoulder. The boy climbed up and sat very straight, his feet dangling above the floor, his hands folded in his lap. I took the chair across from them, smoothing my skirts with movements that felt automatic and meaningless. Mrs. Bellamy appeared in the doorway, her face pale and worried. I asked her to bring tea. She hesitated, glancing between me and James, and then she nodded and disappeared. The silence that followed was thick and suffocating. I looked at James, and he looked back, and I realized that I did not know where to begin. There were too many questions, too many impossible truths demanding acknowledgement. How could Thomas be alive? Where had he been? Why had James let me believe my son was dead for 5 years? I asked the last question first. Why? Just that single word, but it contained everything. Why had he done this to me? Why had he let me suffer? Why had he taken my child and let me bury an empty grave and spend 5 years drowning in grief? James flinched as though I had struck him, and for a moment he said nothing. Then he leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his hands clasped tightly together. His voice when he spoke was rough, as though the words were being dragged from somewhere deep inside him. He told me that Thomas had not died that night. He told me that the fever had been real, that my son had been desperately ill, that the doctor had said there was no hope, but Peter had not been willing to accept that. Peter, my quiet and unassuming husband, had sent word to James in secret. James had been stationed near the coast, preparing to ship out with his regiment, and when the message came, he had abandoned his post and ridden through the night to reach Ashford Manor. He had arrived too late to see me, but not too late to see Thomas. The boy had been alive, barely. His breathing had been shallow and labored, his small body burning with fever. The doctor had already told Peter to prepare for the worst, had already suggested that they summon the priest. But James had refused to give up. He had contacts in the city, physicians who had studied on the continent, men who used methods the country doctors dismissed as radical or dangerous. He had taken Thomas in the middle of the night, wrapped in blankets, and carried him to London. Peter had helped him. Peter had arranged everything, had paid for the physicians, had kept the secret. I stared at James, my mind struggling to make sense of what he was telling me. Peter had known. Peter had let me believe my son was dead. Peter had held me while I wept and never once told me the truth. I felt a surge of anger so fierce it took my breath away, and then, just as quickly, it collapsed into something else. Confusion, betrayal, a grief so deep and so complicated that I did not know how to name it. James continued. He told me that the physicians in London had saved Thomas, but just barely. The boy had been weak for months, fragile and prone to illness, and James had kept him in the city, in a house he had rented under a false name. He had hired nurses, had paid for the best care, had visited whenever he could between deployments. He had wanted to tell me. He had begged Peter to let him tell me. But Peter had refused. Peter had believed, James said, that if I knew Thomas was alive, I would leave. I would go to London, would reclaim my son, would create a scandal that would destroy us all. The truth of Thomas's parentage would come out. My reputation would be ruined. The Ashford name would be tainted, and James, as a soldier with no fortune and no title, would be unable to protect me from the consequences. So Peter had made a choice. He had told me that Thomas was dead, had held a funeral, had buried an empty coffin, and he had made James promise to stay away, to keep the boy hidden, to let me grieve and move on. I could not breathe. The room seemed to spin, and I gripped the arms of my chair so hard my knuckles went white. Peter had done this. Peter, who had been so kind, so patient, so understanding. Peter, who had given my son his name and his protection. Peter, who had held me while I screamed and never once told me that the child I was mourning was alive. I did not know whether to hate him or thank him. I did not know whether his choice had been an act of love or an act of unforgivable cruelty. James was still speaking. He told me that he had tried to honor Peter's wishes, had tried to stay away, but that it had been impossible. He had thought of me every day. He had written letters he never sent. And when Peter had died 2 years ago, James had wanted to come to me immediately, to bring Thomas home, to tell me the truth. But by then he had been called back to the war, sent to the front lines, and he had not been certain he would survive. He had not wanted to reappear in my life, only to die and leave me grieving again. So he had waited. He had fought and survived and been promoted, and when his older brother had died without an heir, he had inherited the dukedom. He had gained the title and the fortune and the power that Peter had believed he lacked. And then finally he had come home. He had come to bring me my son. I looked at Thomas, at this small, quiet boy who sat so still and watchful, and I felt a pain so sharp it was almost physical. 5 years. I had lost 5 years with him. 5 years of watching him grow, of hearing his first words, of teaching him to read and to ride and to laugh. 5 years of bedtime stories and scraped knees and the 1,000 small moments that made up a childhood. And I could never get them back. No matter what happened now, no matter how much time we had together, those years were gone. Thomas was watching me. I wondered what James had told him, what he understood about who I was. Did he know I was his mother? Did he remember me at all? Or was I simply a stranger who had wept over him in a drawing room? I wanted to ask, but I could not make the words come. I was afraid of the answer. Mrs. Bellamy returned with the tea, setting the tray on the table with hands that trembled slightly. She did not look at me as she poured, and I was grateful. I did not think I could bear her pity or her questions. When she left, I picked up my cup and held it without drinking, letting the warmth seep into my cold fingers. James took a cup as well, and then he leaned over and helped Thomas with his, adding extra milk and sugar, a gesture so tender and so familiar that it made my throat tighten. I watched them together, and I saw the bond that had formed between them, the ease and the trust. Thomas looked to James for reassurance, and James gave it without hesitation, his hand resting briefly on the boy's shoulder, his voice soft when he spoke. They had been together for 5 years. James had raised my son. James had been there for all the moments I had missed, and I did not know whether to be grateful or devastated. I asked Thomas if he knew who I was. My voice was barely more than a whisper, and for a moment I thought he had not heard me. But then he looked up from his tea, his gray eyes meeting mine, and he nodded. James told me, he said. His voice was clear and steady, a child's voice, but with an odd formality to it, as though he had been taught to speak carefully. He said, "You are my mother." He said, "You thought I was gone, but I was not." He said, "You loved me very much." Tears spilled down my cheeks before I could stop them. I set my cup down with shaking hands and pressed my fingers to my mouth, trying to hold back the sob that threatened to escape. Thomas watched me, and then he slid down from the sofa and crossed the room to where I sat. He stopped in front of me, small and solemn, and then he reached out and took my hand. His fingers were warm and sticky from the sugar in his tea, and the touch was so simple and so complete that it broke something inside me. I pulled him close, and this time he came willingly, climbing into my lap as though he had done it 100 times before. He was heavier than I expected, solid and real, and I wrapped my arms around him and held him as though I could make up for all the years I had lost. He rested his head against my shoulder, and I felt his breath against my neck, warm and steady, and I thought that I would give anything, do anything, to keep him safe, to never let him go again. James was watching us, and when I looked up at him, I saw that his eyes were bright with unshed tears. We stayed like that for a long time, the three of us in the drawing room, with the rain falling outside and the fire crackling in the hearth. There were still so many questions, so many things that needed to be said and explained and forgiven. But for now, in this moment, it was enough to simply be together. Finally, James spoke again. He told me that he understood if I hated him, if I could never forgive him for what he had done. He told me that he had spent 5 years carrying the weight of Peter's decision, and that there had been many nights when he had wondered if it had been the right choice. But he had also watched Thomas grow, had seen him become a bright and curious boy, and he had known that keeping him alive had been worth any price. I did not know what to say. I was angry, yes, but I was also exhausted and overwhelmed, and so full of conflicting emotions that I could not separate one from the other. I looked down at Thomas, at his dark curls and his small hands clutching at my sleeve, and I knew that whatever else had happened, whatever lies had been told and secrets kept, my son was alive. And that was all that mattered. I told James that I did not know if I could forgive him. I told him that I did not know if I could forgive Peter, even in death. But I also told him that I was grateful, desperately and impossibly grateful, that Thomas was here, that he was safe, that I had been given a second chance I never thought I would have. James nodded, and I saw the relief in his face, the hope that maybe, somehow, we could find a way through this. He asked if he could stay. "Not in the house," he said quickly, "but nearby. There was an inn in the village, and he could take rooms there. He wanted to give Thomas time to adjust, to let him get to know me without the pressure of too much too soon. And he wanted to explain everything, to answer all my questions, to help me understand the choices that had been made." I agreed, though part of me wanted to refuse, wanted to send him away and keep Thomas here with me and pretend that the past 5 years had never happened. But I knew that was not possible. Thomas loved James. That much was clear, and whatever anger I felt toward James, whatever pain and betrayal still burned in my chest, I could not take away the only father my son had ever known. James stood, and Thomas climbed down from my lap, reluctant but obedient. I walked them to the door, my hand resting on Thomas's shoulder, unwilling to let him go even for a moment. James promised to return in the morning, to bring Thomas back, so that we could spend the day together. He looked at me as he said it, and I saw the question in his eyes, the uncertainty. I nodded, and he smiled, a small and weary smile that reminded me of the boy I had fallen in love with so many years ago. They left, and I stood in the doorway and watched the carriage pull away, watched until it disappeared down the drive and into the rain. Then I closed the door and leaned against it, my legs finally giving way, and I slid down to the floor and let myself cry. I cried for the years I had lost, for the lies I had believed, for the grief that had consumed me and the hope I had been too afraid to feel. And I cried for Thomas, for my son who was alive and beautiful and here, and for the terrifying and wonderful truth that I was a mother again. When I finally stood, when I finally wiped my face and steadied my breath, I walked back into the drawing room and picked up the letter James had sent, the one I had left unopened on the table. I broke the seal and unfolded it, and I read the words he had written in his careful, slanted hand. "Eleanor," it began, "I have no right to ask for your forgiveness. I have no right to ask for anything at all, but I am asking anyway, because there is a boy who deserves to know his mother and a woman who deserves to know her son. Please let me explain. Please give me the chance to make this right. I have loved you since the first moment I saw you, and I have never stopped, not for a single day. Not even when I thought I had lost you forever. I folded the letter and held it against my chest, and I stood there in the silence of my empty house, and I let myself feel everything. The anger and the pain and the love and the fear. And beneath it all, fragile and insistent, a small, bright flicker of something I had not felt in so long, I almost did not recognize it. Hope. They came back the next morning just as the sun broke through the clouds, turning the wet grass silver and the stone walls of the manor a pale gold. I had not slept. I had spent the night pacing the halls, sitting by the window, reading and rereading James's letter until the words blurred together. Every few hours I had walked to Thomas's old nursery, the room I had locked after his death and never entered again. I stood outside the door with my hand on the handle, but I could not bring myself to open it. Not yet. Not until I knew he was truly coming back. When I heard the carriage wheels on the drive, my heart lurched so violently I thought I might be sick. I pressed my hand to my chest and forced myself to breathe, to move, to walk down the stairs with some semblance of dignity. Mrs. Bellamy was already at the door, her face flushed with excitement she was trying to hide. She had not asked me any questions last night, but I knew she had seen Thomas, had recognized him, and that by now the entire household would be whispering about the impossible child who had returned from the dead. I reached the entrance hall just as she opened the door, and there he was. Thomas, my son. He stood on the threshold in a blue coat that looked new, his dark curls combed neatly, his small hand clasped in James's. When he saw me, his face brightened, and he pulled free and ran toward me with the unguarded joy of a child who had not yet learned to doubt affection. I caught him and lifted him, and he wrapped his arms around my neck and pressed his cheek to mine, and I felt the last wall around my heart begin to crumble. "Good morning, Mama," he said, and the words stopped my breath. Mama. I had dreamed of hearing him say it, had imagined it 1,000 times, but the reality was so much more than I had prepared for. I held him tighter and buried my face in his hair and whispered good morning back, my voice breaking on the words. James stood in the doorway watching us, and when I looked up, I saw something in his expression that made my chest ache. Longing, perhaps, or regret. He looked as though he had not slept either, his face shadowed and drawn. But there was a softness in his eyes that I remembered from before, from the days when we had been reckless and young and foolish enough to believe that love could conquer everything. I set Thomas down and smoothed his hair, and he smiled up at me with such trust that I felt the weight of responsibility settle over me like a cloak. This child had been through so much, had been uprooted and moved and told that the woman he was meeting was his mother, and yet he stood here smiling at me as though it were the most natural thing in the world. I did not know what James had told him, how much he understood, but I knew that I would do everything in my power to make sure he never doubted that he was loved. James stepped inside, removing his hat and nodding to Mrs. Bellamy. I invited him into the drawing room, and Thomas followed, skipping a little, his earlier formality replaced by the energy of a child who had spent too long sitting still. I watched him explore the room, touching the spines of the books on the shelves, peering at the miniatures on the mantelpiece, and I marveled at how alive he was, how real. James sat across from me, and for a moment neither of us spoke. The silence was not uncomfortable, but it was weighted with everything we had not yet said. Finally, I asked him how Thomas had spent the night, whether he had slept well, whether he had been frightened or confused. James shook his head and told me that Thomas had been excited, that he had asked questions about me, about the house, about whether there were horses he could see and gardens he could explore. "He is a resilient boy," James said quietly. "He has had to be." I heard the pain in his voice, the unspoken acknowledgement that Thomas's childhood had been marked by upheaval and uncertainty, and I felt a fresh surge of anger at Peter, at James, at the choices that had been made without my knowledge or consent. But I pushed it down. There would be time for anger later. Right now, I needed to focus on my son. I asked Thomas if he would like to see the gardens, and his face lit up. He took my hand without hesitation, and we walked together through the house and out the back door, James following a few steps behind. The rain had stopped, and the air smelled of wet earth and roses. Thomas ran ahead, his shoes squelching in the damp grass, and I watched him with a mixture of joy and sorrow. He was so small, so full of life, and I had missed so much. We walked to the pond where the swans nested, and Thomas crouched at the edge and watched them glide across the water, his face rapt with fascination. I stood beside him, and James stood beside me, and for a moment it felt almost normal, as though we were a family who had always been together. But I knew it was an illusion. We were not a family. We were three people bound by love and lies, and a history too complicated to untangle. James spoke, his voice low enough that Thomas could not hear. He told me that he had thought about this moment for years, had imagined it in 100 different ways, but that the reality was more overwhelming than he had expected. He told me that seeing me with Thomas, seeing the way the boy had run to me and called me Mama, had been both a relief and a heartbreak. He had been afraid, he said, that Thomas would reject me, that the bond between them would make it impossible for the child to accept anyone else. But Thomas had taken to me immediately, and James was grateful, even as it reminded him of everything he had taken from me. I told him that I did not want his guilt. I told him that guilt was useless, that it changed nothing, and that if we were going to move forward, we needed to focus on Thomas, not on the past. James nodded, but I could see that he did not believe me, that he was carrying the weight of his choices like a stone around his neck. I understood. I was carrying my own weight, the grief and the anger, and the terrible aching love I still felt for him, even after everything. Thomas called to us, pointing at the swans, and we walked over to join him. He asked me their names, and I told him I had never named them, that I had always thought of them simply as the swans. He frowned considering this, and then he announced that we should name them now. He decided on Apollo and Artemis, names he said James had taught him from a book of myths, and I smiled despite myself. Of course James had been reading him mythology. Of course my son knew the names of Greek gods before he was 6 years old. We spent the morning together, the three of us, walking through the gardens and the orchard, and Thomas talked almost constantly, asking questions and telling stories and pointing out every bird and flower and interesting stone. He was bright and curious and utterly charming, and I fell in love with him all over again with every word he spoke. James watched us with an expression I could not quite read, something between happiness and sadness, and I wondered what he was thinking, what he hoped would happen now that the truth was out. When we returned to the house, Mrs. Bellamy had prepared luncheon, and we ate in the small dining room with the windows open and the sunlight streaming in. Thomas ate with the appetite of a healthy child, chattering between bites, and I found myself laughing at something he said, a real laugh, the first I had felt in years. James looked at me across the table, and our eyes met, and for a moment the air between us seemed to shimmer with something I was afraid to name. After lunch, Thomas asked if he could see his old nursery. The question caught me off guard, and I glanced at James, who looked equally surprised. I had not told him about the nursery, about the fact that I had locked it away and never returned. But of course Thomas would want to see it. Of course he would be curious about the place where he had spent the first months of his life. I agreed, though my hands were trembling as I led him upstairs. James followed, silent and watchful. The nursery was at the end of the east wing, a bright room with tall windows and pale blue walls. I had not been inside in 5 years, and when I opened the door, the air smelled stale and unused. Dust motes danced in the sunlight, and the furniture was covered with sheets. Thomas walked in slowly, looking around with wide eyes, and I wondered what he remembered, if anything. James told me that Thomas had been too young to remember much, that his memories of this place would be vague and dreamlike at best. But the boy seemed drawn to the cradle by the window, and he crossed the room and stood beside it, running his small fingers over the carved wood. I had rocked him in that cradle, had sung to him and watched him sleep and prayed that he would live to see morning. And then he had been taken from me, and I had never seen him in it again. Thomas turned to me and asked if this was where he had slept when he was a baby. I nodded, not trusting my voice, and he smiled and said he liked it, that it felt safe. I did not know how to respond to that, so I simply crossed the room and knelt beside him, and together we looked at the cradle, at the blankets still folded inside, soft and faded with age. James cleared his throat and said that perhaps we should leave the room as it was for now, that there would be time to decide what to do with it later. But I shook my head. I told him that I wanted Thomas to have it, that I wanted him to know this was his home, that this room was his if he wanted it. Thomas looked up at me, his gray eyes serious, and asked if that meant he would be staying here with me. The question hung in the air, heavy and fraught, and I realized that we had not yet discussed what would happen next, where Thomas would live, what role James would play in his life. I looked at James, and he looked back, and I saw the uncertainty in his face, the fear that I would try to take Thomas from him, or that he would have to take Thomas from me. I told Thomas that I wanted him to stay, that I wanted him to live here and be my son, but that James was important to him too, and that we would need to talk about how to make sure he had both of us. Thomas seemed satisfied with this answer, and he nodded and turned back to the cradle, and I stood and walked to the window, pressing my forehead against the cool glass. James came to stand beside me, close enough that I could feel the warmth of him, and he spoke quietly so that Thomas could not hear. He told me that he had no intention of taking Thomas away from me, that he had brought the boy here to give him back to me, not to claim him for himself. But he also told me that he loved Thomas, that the boy was as much his son as mine, and that he could not simply disappear from his life. I understood. I hated it, but I understood. Thomas had spent 5 years with James, had been raised by him, had learned to trust him and depend on him. I could not erase that, could not expect the boy to forget the man who had saved his life and cared for him when I could not. And if I was being honest with myself, I did not want James to disappear either. Not entirely. Not when there was still so much unfinished between us. I told him that we would find a way. I did not know what that way would look like, but I knew that we owed it to Thomas to try. James nodded, and I saw the relief in his face, the gratitude. He reached out as though to touch my hand, and then he stopped, his fingers hovering in the air between us, and I realized that he was waiting for permission, for some sign that I would allow him close again. I did not give it, not yet. I turned away and called to Thomas, telling him that we should go downstairs and have tea, and he came running, full of energy and light. We left the nursery, and I closed the door behind us, but I did not lock it. I would not lock it again. The afternoon passed in a haze of conversation and small moments. Thomas showed me the book of myths James had given him, and I read to him by the fire while James sat across from us, watching. When evening came, James said it was time to go, and Thomas hugged me tightly and made me promise that he could come back tomorrow. I promised, and I meant it with every fiber of my being. After they left, I sat alone in the drawing room and stared into the fire. The house felt different now, less empty, as though Thomas's presence had filled it with something I had thought was lost forever. I thought about James, about the way he had looked at me, about the careful distance he kept, and the longing I saw in his eyes. I thought about Peter, about the choices he had made and the secret he had kept, and I wondered if I would ever be able to forgive him. But most of all, I thought about Thomas, about my son who was alive and beautiful and here, and I knew that whatever happened next, whatever pain or complications lay ahead, I would face them all. Because he was worth it. Because he was everything. And as I sat there in the firelight, I let myself hope that maybe, just maybe, we could find a way to be whole again. The days that followed took on a rhythm I had not expected, a delicate balance between joy and uncertainty. Thomas came to the manor every morning, sometimes with James, sometimes delivered by a driver James had hired from the inn. I treasured every moment, every conversation, every small discovery about the boy my son had become. He was clever and gentle, quick to laugh, but also thoughtful in ways that surprised me. He asked questions about everything, about the paintings on the walls, the names of the flowers in the garden, the stories behind the old books in the library. And I answered them all, grateful for each one, grateful that he wanted to know. But there was a shadow over everything, a question that neither James nor I seemed willing to address directly. What would happen when the week ended, when James returned to his estate, when the illusion of this temporary arrangement collapsed? Thomas had begun to settle in, had begun to treat the manor as his home, and I could see the conflict in his small face when evening came, and it was time to leave. He did not want to go back to the inn. He wanted to stay with me. But he also did not want to leave James. I knew that I needed to speak with James, to have the conversation we had been avoiding, but every time I resolved to do so, I lost my courage. I was afraid of what he might say, afraid that he would tell me he was taking Thomas back to London, back to the life they had built together. And I was afraid of what I might say, of the anger and hurt that still simmered beneath the surface, waiting to spill over. It was Thomas who forced the issue, in the way that children often do, with an innocence that cut straight to the heart of things. We were in the garden one afternoon, the three of us, and Thomas was chasing a butterfly through the roses when he stopped suddenly and turned to look at us. "Why do I have to leave every night?" he asked. "Why can I not stay here with you, Mama, and have James stay too?" The silence that followed was deafening. James and I looked at each other, and I saw my own uncertainty reflected in his eyes. Thomas waited, patient and curious, and I knew that we owed him an answer, that we could not keep dancing around the truth. I knelt down so that I was at his level, and I told him that it was complicated, that James had responsibilities and a home of his own, and that we were still trying to decide what was best for everyone. But Thomas shook his head, his young face set with a determination that reminded me painfully of myself. "It is not complicated," he said. "I want to be with both of you. Why can you not both be here?" And then, before I could answer, he looked at James and asked the question that had been haunting me since the moment they arrived. "Do you not love Mama anymore?" James went very still. I watched the color drain from his face, watched him struggle for words, and I felt my heart begin to race. Thomas was still waiting, his gray eyes moving between us, and I realized that he had seen something we thought we had hidden, some tension or sadness or unspoken longing that children always seem to sense. James finally spoke, his voice rough and low. "I have always loved your Mama," he said. "I have never stopped, not for a single day." Thomas considered this, his small brow furrowed, and then he turned to me and asked the same question. "Do you love James?" I could not breathe. I could not think. Every instinct told me to deflect, to tell Thomas that it was not that simple, that love alone was not enough. But he was looking at me with such open trust, such certainty that the world made sense and that the people he loved should be together, and I found that I could not lie to him. "Not about this." "Yes," I said. "I do." The words felt like a confession, like something I had been holding in for so long that speaking them aloud was both a relief and a terror. James stared at me, and I saw the shock in his face, the disbelief, and then something else, something that looked almost like hope. Thomas smiled, a bright and uncomplicated smile, and said that if we loved each other, then we should be together, and that he should live here with both of us. It was so simple in his mind, so clear, and I wished desperately that it could be that easy. But the world was not a child's storybook. There were rules and expectations, and 100 reasons why what Thomas wanted was impossible. James seemed to recover himself. He told Thomas that the situation was more complicated than it seemed, that there were things he was too young to understand. But Thomas shook his head stubbornly and said that grown people always said things were complicated when they did not want to do something. And then he crossed his arms and announced that he was not leaving tonight, that he was staying here with me, and that James should stay too. I expected James to argue, to insist that we needed more time, but instead he looked at me and I saw the question in his eyes. He was asking for permission, asking if I would allow it, if I was ready for him to stay. And I realized, standing there in the garden with my son between us, that I was. I was tired of the careful distance, tired of pretending that I did not feel what I felt. If James was willing to stay, if he was willing to risk whatever this was, then so was I. I told Thomas that he could stay and that James could stay as well, but that it was only for one night, and that we would need to talk about what happened next. Thomas cheered and threw his arms around me, and then he ran to James and hugged him too. And James lifted him and held him close, his eyes never leaving mine. That evening, we had dinner together in the small dining room, and it felt like something out of a dream, like a glimpse of a life that might have been. Thomas talked non-stop, telling stories and asking questions, and James and I answered him, passing dishes and pouring wine, and for a few hours it was almost possible to forget that we were not a real family, that this was not our everyday life. After dinner, I took Thomas upstairs to the nursery. We had spent the past few days cleaning it, airing out the linens and uncovering the furniture, and it looked almost the way it had before, bright and welcoming. Thomas was delighted with everything, with the rocking horse by the window and the toy soldiers on the shelf and the soft bed with its patchwork quilt. I helped him wash and change into his night clothes, and then I tucked him in and sat beside him, and he asked me to tell him a story. I told him about the manor, about the family who had built it and the generations who had lived here, and he listened with wide eyes, his small hand wrapped around mine. When I finished, he asked me if I had been happy here when I was young, and I told him that I had been, but that I was happier now that he was here with me. He smiled and closed his eyes, and within minutes he was asleep, his breathing soft and even. I sat there for a long time, watching him, memorizing the curve of his cheek and the way his lashes rested against his skin. I thought about the 5 years I had lost, about the empty nights and the grief that had consumed me, and I felt a surge of anger so fierce it took my breath away. But then I looked at Thomas, at his peaceful sleeping face, and I knew that I could not afford to dwell on the past. He was here now. That was all that mattered. When I finally went downstairs, I found James in the drawing room, standing by the window with a glass of whiskey in his hand. He turned when he heard me, and for a moment we simply looked at each other. Then he set down his glass and crossed the room, and he stopped in front of me, close enough that I could see the lines at the corners of his eyes, the gray at his temples, the weariness in his face. He told me that he had not planned for any of this, that he had come here intending only to bring Thomas to me and then leave, to let me decide what I wanted without pressure or expectation. But Thomas had complicated things, had asked questions, and made demands that neither of us could ignore. And now James did not know what to do. He did not know if he should stay or go, if I wanted him here, or if I was simply tolerating his presence for Thomas's sake. I told him the truth. I told him that I did not know what I wanted, that I was still angry and hurt and confused, but that I also could not imagine him leaving, could not imagine facing this alone. I told him that I had spent 5 years trying to forget him, trying to bury the love I felt beneath layers of grief and resentment, and that it had not worked. I still loved him. I had never stopped, but I did not know if that was enough, if love could bridge the distance between what we had been and what we were now. James reached out and took my hand, his touch tentative, as though he expected me to pull away. But I did not. I let him hold my hand, let him lace his fingers through mine, and I felt the warmth of his skin and the strength of his grip. And I remembered what it had been like to be young and reckless and utterly certain that we belonged together. He told me that he understood if I could not forgive him, that he had made choices he would regret for the rest of his life. But he also told me that he had never stopped loving me, that every decision he had made had been an attempt to protect me, even if it had been misguided and wrong. He had thought that letting me believe Thomas was dead would spare me the pain of knowing the truth, the scandal, and the heartbreak. He had thought that keeping his distance would give me a chance to move on, to find peace. But he had been wrong about all of it, and he knew that now. I asked him what he wanted, what he hoped would happen. And he looked at me with an intensity that made my heart stutter, and he said that he wanted a second chance. He wanted to be the man I had fallen in love with, the man who had promised to find a way. He wanted to be a father to Thomas and a partner to me, if I would let him. He wanted us to be a family, not a secret or a scandal, but a real family, bound by love and choice and commitment. I told him that I did not know if that was possible, that the world we lived in did not look kindly on unconventional arrangements, on widows who took lovers and dukes who raised illegitimate children. But even as I said it, I felt the resistance crumbling, felt the walls I had built around my heart begin to crack. Because I wanted it too. I wanted the life James was offering, the impossible, beautiful dream of being together. James stepped closer, and I did not move away. He lifted his hand and touched my face, his fingers gentle against my cheek, and he asked if he could kiss me. It was such a simple question, such a careful and respectful gesture, and it undid me completely. I nodded, and he leaned down and pressed his lips to mine, and it was nothing like the desperate stolen kisses of our youth. It was slow and tender and full of everything we had not said, all the years and the pain and the love that had survived it all. When we finally pulled apart, I was trembling. James rested his forehead against mine, and we stood there in the quiet drawing room with the fire burning low and the night pressing against the windows. And I felt something shift inside me, something that had been frozen and numb beginning to thaw. He asked if he could stay, not just for tonight, but for as long as I would let him. And I said yes. I said yes because I was tired of being alone, tired of grieving and hiding and pretending that I did not need him. I said yes because Thomas deserved to have both of us, because he deserved to grow up in a house full of love instead of secrets. And I said yes because, despite everything, I still believed that James and I belonged together, that we had always belonged together, and that maybe, against all odds, we had been given a second chance to make it right. We went upstairs together, and James looked in on Thomas, who was still sleeping soundly, his small face peaceful in the moonlight. Then we stood in the hallway outside the nursery, and James asked where I wanted him to sleep. I hesitated, and he saw the uncertainty in my face, and he told me that he would take a guest room, that he did not expect anything, that he simply wanted to be near us. But I shook my head. I told him that I did not want him in a guest room, that I did not want to keep pretending that there was nothing between us. I took his hand and led him to my room, and he followed without a word. We did not speak as I closed the door behind us, as we stood in the dim light and looked at each other. And when he reached for me again, when he pulled me close and kissed me with a desperation that matched my own, I let myself fall, let myself believe that this was real, that we could make this work. We made love that night, slowly and carefully, as though we were learning each other all over again. And afterward, as I lay in his arms and listened to his heartbeat, steady and strong beneath my ear, I felt something I had not felt in years. I felt safe. I felt whole. I felt like I had finally come home. In the morning, I woke to find Thomas standing beside the bed, his eyes wide with surprise and delight. He looked at James, still asleep beside me, and then at me, and he smiled, a smile so bright and pure that it made my chest ache. "You stayed," he said to James, and there was such happiness in his voice that I knew, whatever challenges lay ahead, we had made the right choice. James woke and pulled Thomas into the bed with us, and the three of us lay there together, tangled in the sheets and the morning light, and I thought that this moment was worth everything. It was worth the pain and the years and the impossible choices, because we were together, and we were a family. The world outside our small haven did not take long to notice. Within a week of James moving into the manor, the whispers began. I saw it in the way the shopkeepers looked at me when I went into the village, in the sudden silences that fell when I entered a room, in the carefully worded notes from acquaintances who had not bothered to write to me in years. The widow Ashford was living openly with the Duke of Ravensmoor. The widow Ashford had a child no one had known existed. The widow Ashford was a scandal. I had expected this. I had known that choosing James, choosing this life, would come at a cost. But I had underestimated how much it would hurt, how the judgment of others could make me doubt even my most certain choices. I found myself defensive and brittle, snapping at Mrs. Bellamy over small things, lying awake at night wondering if I had made a terrible mistake, if Thomas would suffer for the choices James and I had made. James saw it, of course. He had always been able to read me, even when I tried to hide. One evening, after Thomas had gone to bed, he found me in the library, staring at a letter I had received from a distant cousin. The letter was polite on the surface, but beneath the pleasantries was a clear message. I was disappointing the family. I was bringing shame to the Ashford name. I should consider the consequences of my actions, particularly for the child. James took the letter from my hands and read it, his jaw tightening. Then he tore it in half and threw it into the fire. He told me that I should not waste my time on the opinions of people who knew nothing about us, who had never bothered to understand what we had been through. But I told him it was not that simple, that Thomas would have to live in this world, would have to face the whispers and the judgment, and that I could not protect him from it. James sat beside me and took my hands in his. He told me that he had a solution, one he had been considering since the day he brought Thomas here. He asked me to marry him, not because society demanded it, not because it would silence the gossips, but because he loved me, because he wanted to spend the rest of his life with me, because he wanted Thomas to grow up knowing that his parents were committed to each other and to him. I stared at him, my heart racing. Marriage. It was the obvious answer, the respectable solution, the thing that would turn scandal into romance and make our unconventional family acceptable in the eyes of the world. But it was also terrifying. My first marriage had been one of convenience, of safety and practicality, and while Peter had been kind, there had been no passion, no depth of feeling. Marrying James would be different. It would be a choice made from love, and that made it both more beautiful and more frightening. I asked him if he was certain, if he truly wanted to bind himself to me and to Thomas, to take on the responsibility and the complications and the inevitable challenges. And he said yes, without hesitation. He said that he had spent 6 years regretting the choices he had made, the ways he had failed me, and that if I would give him the chance, he would spend the rest of his life making it right. I said yes. I said yes because I loved him, because I could not imagine my life without him, because Thomas deserved to have both of his parents together. And I said yes because, despite all the pain and the secrets and the years we had lost, I still believed that we were meant to be together, that our love had survived because it was real and true and worth fighting for. We married quietly in the small church on the estate, with only Mrs. Bellamy and Thomas and the vicar as witnesses. I wore a simple dress of pale blue silk, and James wore his uniform, and Thomas stood between us holding a bouquet of wildflowers he had picked from the garden. The vicar pronounced us man and wife, and James kissed me, and Thomas cheered, and I felt a happiness so complete and so overwhelming that I thought my heart might burst. The marriage changed things in ways both large and small. The whispers did not stop entirely, but they softened. A widow remarrying was acceptable, particularly to a man of James's standing. And while there were still those who questioned the suddenness of it all, who speculated about Thomas's parentage and the true nature of our relationship, most people chose to accept the story we presented. The Duke of Ravensmoor had fallen in love with the widow Ashford. He had brought her late husband's son into his home and claimed him as his own. It was a love story, unconventional perhaps, but ultimately respectable. Thomas thrived. He had both of his parents now, and the security of knowing that we were together, that he would not be separated from either of us. He grew more confident, more open, his laughter ringing through the halls of the manor in a way that made my chest ache with gratitude. He and James were inseparable, riding together in the mornings, reading together in the evenings, and I watched them with a mixture of joy and bittersweet regret for the years I had missed. But I also built my own bond with Thomas, different from the one he had with James, but no less important. I taught him to paint and to play the piano. I told him stories about my own childhood, about the manor and the family and the history that was now his. And he told me about his years in London, about the nurses who had cared for him and the parks where James had taken him. And I listened to every word, storing them away like precious treasures. One afternoon, several months after the wedding, Thomas asked me about Peter. He had seen Peter's portrait in the gallery and had wanted to know who he was. I hesitated, unsure how much to tell him, but James nodded encouragingly, and I decided that Thomas deserved the truth, or at least as much of it as he could understand. I told him that Peter had been my first husband, that he had been a good and kind man who had loved him very much. I told him that Peter had helped to save his life, that without Peter's help, he would not be here. Thomas listened solemnly, and then he asked if Peter had known that James was his real father. I said yes, and that Peter had kept the secret because he wanted to protect all of us, because he knew that the world was not always kind to people who did not follow the rules. Thomas thought about this, his young face serious, and then he said that he was glad Peter had been kind, and that he wished he could have known him. I told him that Peter would have loved to know him too, that he had grieved for him just as I had, and that wherever Peter was now, he would be happy to know that Thomas was safe and loved. James reached over and squeezed my hand, and I saw the gratitude in his eyes, the appreciation that I had honored Peter's memory even as I built a new life with James. Because Peter deserved that. He had made choices I did not agree with, had kept secrets that had caused me unimaginable pain, but he had also saved my son's life, and for that I would be forever grateful. As the months turned into a year, life at the manor settled into a comfortable rhythm. James managed his estates and his responsibilities as a duke, traveling occasionally to London, but always returning within a few days. I oversaw the household and the gardens, and I began to paint again, something I had not done since before Thomas was born. And Thomas grew, becoming taller and stronger, his dark curls lightening to a soft brown, his gray eyes bright with intelligence and curiosity. We had challenges, of course. There were days when the weight of the past felt too heavy, when I woke from nightmares of finding Thomas cold in his cradle, when James and I argued about decisions or old wounds that had not fully healed. But we worked through them, learning to communicate, to forgive, to lean on each other when things became difficult. And slowly, gradually, the wounds began to heal. One evening, as we sat together in the drawing room, Thomas asleep upstairs and the fire crackling softly, James asked me if I was happy. It was a simple question, but it held so much weight, so much hope and uncertainty. And I realized, looking at him, at the man who had come back into my life and turned it upside down, that I was. I was happy in a way I had never been before, not even in the early days of our love when everything had been new and exciting and full of promise. I told him yes. I told him that I had spent so many years believing that happiness was something I had lost forever, that I was destined to live in the shadow of grief and regret. But he had given me a second chance, had given me back my son, and offered me a love that was deeper and more mature than what we had shared before. And for that, I would be grateful for the rest of my life. James smiled, and I saw the relief in his face, the joy. He told me that he had been afraid when he first came here, that I would never forgive him, that the damage was too great to be repaired. But I had proven him wrong. I had chosen to love him despite everything, and that was the greatest gift he had ever received. We sat together in the firelight, his arm around my shoulders, and I rested my head against his chest and listened to his heartbeat, steady and sure. And I thought about the journey we had taken, the pain and the loss and the impossible choices, and I knew that it had all been worth it. Because we were together, because we had Thomas, because we had found our way back to each other. A few weeks later, Thomas came running into the drawing room, his face flushed with excitement. He had been exploring the attic with Mrs. Bellamy's permission, and he had found a box of old things, letters and photographs and small trinkets that had belonged to my family. Among them was a miniature portrait, painted when I was a young girl, and Thomas held it up and said that I looked just like him, that we had the same eyes and the same smile. I took the portrait from him and looked at it, and I saw what he meant. There was a resemblance, something in the shape of the face and the expression, and it made me realize how much of myself I saw in him, how much he was a part of me in ways that went beyond blood and biology. He was my son in every way that mattered, and no amount of time or distance could change that. James came over and looked at the portrait too, and he put his arm around Thomas and said that the boy was lucky to have inherited his mother's beauty and his father's charm, and Thomas laughed and said that he hoped he had also inherited his mother's talent for painting and his father's skill with horses. And I thought, listening to them banter and tease each other, that this was what family was supposed to be. Not perfect, not without its complications and its pain, but filled with love and laughter and the kind of everyday moments that made life worth living. As Thomas ran off to continue his exploration, James and I stood together by the window, looking out at the gardens. Spring had come again, and the roses were beginning to bloom, their colors bright against the gray stone of the manor. James said that he had been thinking about the future, about what would happen when Thomas was older, when he would need to know the full truth about his parentage and the choices that had been made. I told him that we would tell him together, that we would answer his questions honestly, and help him understand that everything we had done had been out of love, even the things that had been misguided or wrong. And James agreed, and he said that he believed Thomas would understand, that the boy had a kind heart and a generous spirit, and that he would be able to forgive us for the mistakes we had made. I hoped he was right. I hoped that when the time came, Thomas would see that we had done our best, that we had tried to protect him and give him the life he deserved. And I hoped that he would know, without question or doubt, that he was loved, that he had always been loved, from the moment he was born until the end of our days. Years passed, and Thomas grew into a fine young man, intelligent and compassionate and full of life. He went to university and traveled, and made his own way in the world, but he always came home, always returned to the manor where he had been raised. And when he married and had children of his own, he brought them to visit, and I watched him with his family and saw the kind of father he had become, patient and loving and devoted, and I knew that despite everything, we had done something right. James and I grew old together. We had disagreements and challenges, as all couples do, but we faced them together, and our love deepened with each passing year. We never forgot the years we had lost, the pain we had endured, but we also never took for granted the years we had been given. We had been given a second chance, a rare and precious gift, and we made the most of it. On quiet evenings, when the house was still and the fire burned low, James and I would sit together as we had done so many times before, and we would talk about the past and the present and the future. And sometimes, when the mood was right, he would take my hand and tell me that he loved me, that he had always loved me, and I would tell him the same. Because it was true. It had always been true. And when my time came, when I was old and tired and ready to rest, I looked back on my life and I felt no regret. I had loved deeply. I had suffered and survived. I had been given the greatest gift of all, the chance to be a mother to my son, to watch him grow and thrive and become the man he was meant to be. And I had spent my days with the man I loved, the man who had fought for me and waited for me and never stopped believing that we could find our way back to each other. As I closed my eyes for the last time, I felt James's hand in mine, warm and familiar, and I heard Thomas's voice somewhere nearby, and I knew that I was surrounded by love, and I thought, with my last conscious breath, that this had been a good life, a complicated life, full of pain and loss and impossible choices, but also a life filled with love and joy and the kind of happiness that only comes from fighting for what matters most. I had been the widow who refused every suitor. I had been the mother who lost her son. And I had been the woman who found her way back to love, who rebuilt her broken heart and made it whole again. And in the end, that was enough. More than enough, it was everything.